Hi folks, Dr. Robert Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. Now, this video is going to be on mood disorders, anxiety and depression, which has been a trend for many of my videos in the recent past. But I wanted to talk about something that was a little bit more experimental, a little bit more theoretical this time. I want to talk about an enzyme that's found in green leafy vegetables and, well, in all plants, because it's present in the leaves of plants. Now this enzyme has a very long name. It's called deribulose 1,5-bisphosphate carboxylase oxygenase, and that enzyme is shortened for obvious reasons to Rubisco. Now Rubisco is the most abundant protein known to man, and the reason it's very abundant is because it's in all plant leaves, and plants cover a vast majority of the surface of this planet. Now, because it's in all leaves, this protein is present in green leafy vegetables, because when we eat green leafy vegetables, we're really just eating the leaves of plants. And Rubisco is an interesting compound because when it's digested in animals and humans, there is a breakdown. There are a number of breakdown products, and these breakdown products may have effects in the central nervous system, and these effects may alter and elevate, in some cases, the mood of the animal or the human. Now, this is very experimental. This is very early research, and there's not a great deal of research on these compounds. Two of the compounds that Rubisco can break down to are called rubiscolin 6 and rubimetide. Now, these breakdown products have been investigated in animal and cell culture models, and they do appear to interact with certain receptors in the central nervous system. And in particular, there may be some interaction with the dopamine receptors in the central nervous system, and there may be some interaction with, for example, some of the prostaglandin receptors and even the opioid receptors. Now, if you've been following my videos, you'll know that dopamine is related to mood, and low levels of dopamine or elevated levels of dopamine, any imbalance in the dopamine system can cause changes in your mood. The same is true for the opioids. The opioids are, we produce opioids naturally in our brain. There are receptors for them, and plants are a very good source of opioids, but we do produce our own endogenous versions, and these have effects on our mood. And we know this because morphine and heroin are able to elevate people's moods, and they cause changes in the central nervous system. Now, prostaglandins are a group of chemicals that are really defined as short-lived hormones. They're actually autocrines, so they don't pass around the blood like normal hormones. They tend to act on cells that are adjacent to one another. And prostaglandins are very important in the inflammatory process. Now, why is this background information important? Well, it's important for a number of reasons. Firstly, if you've been following my videos, you'll know that I recommend eating high plant diets. Now, the reason that high plant diets are beneficial is not only because they're very good for your physical health, but they have clear effects on mood and your mental health. Now, there are many studies that have looked at plant diets, fruits and vegetables, and generally those people with the highest amounts of fruits and vegetables in their diets are at the lowest risk for developing mood disorders. And the evidence tends to show that plant foods are protective of anxiety, and they're protective of the development of depression. Now, green leafy vegetables obviously don't make up a huge amount of everybody's diet. If you're eating a very healthy diet, I'm sure you have plenty of green leafy vegetables, but the population as a whole tend not to eat those foods. And if they do contain chemicals, and these chemical breakdown products of Rubisco are not the only chemicals in them that will be beneficial. There's many other chemicals, many of them antioxidants, that have been shown to have an effect. If these plant compounds are beneficial, then it's one of the main concerns is that the population as a whole, and remember that population has high amounts of anxiety, high amounts of depression. that population as a whole could do themselves favors by eating more plant foods, which is why nutritionists like myself are constantly recommending to people to eat plenty of foods, including lots of fruits and vegetables and green leafy vegetables. So that's the first concern, the first fact that's worth mentioning. The second interesting reason why this is important is because it shows the intricacies of plants. There are many compounds within these plants that we really haven't fully characterized. Scientists are not really sure what they do, and some of them haven't even been discovered. And these breakdown, rubimetide, rubiscolin 6, there may be other breakdown products. They may break down to further products that cause changes. They really haven't been looked at in detail, many of these phytochemicals, and they may, it may come out in the future that there are things that haven't been discovered that are very protective of mood disorders, which would support all of the evidence that show that eating a high plant food diet is protective. So this is just an example of some very early research, some very small amounts of evidence that can be put together to show that foods like spinach, that people know are healthy, are actually, they have distinct mechanisms that may actually show that they are, and evidence that they are beneficial at protecting against depression and anxiety. And the fact that they interact directly with receptors in the central nervous system, including the opioid receptor, the dopamine receptor, and with prostaglandin receptors, is interesting. Prostaglandin receptors are not fully understood themselves, so interaction with them again is not really fully understood. Generally there are inflammatory prostaglandins and there are anti-inflammatory prostaglandins. Now many plant foods actually inhibit inflammation, and it may very well be that these breakdown products of Rubisco are anti-inflammatories, and that may further explain why they are beneficial, because when we're exposed to stress, that stress causes the release of cortisol. The cortisol passes around our blood, including crossing the blood-brain barrier into our brain. And what it does is it triggers inflammatory processes in the brain, and those inflammatory processes cause free radical damage, the generation of free radicals and free radical damage, and that causes lipid peroxidation of the cell membranes of the neurons, and that affects how they work. And this is really the process that occurs when you develop mood disorders. You're generating too many free radicals, you overwhelm the antioxidant defenses, and you start to actually damage your brain tissue. And the hippocampus and the hippocampal area is one of the areas that's been identified as being particularly susceptible to these free radicals and this free radical damage. So plants that can inhibit inflammation are protective of this effect, because they can inhibit the primary cause of all of the damage that's occurring in the brain. And antioxidants will also help because they will mop up the free radicals. And what you tend to find is that generally plant foods are very good anti-inflammatories, and they have high amounts of antioxidants, and they're two of the key areas that are required to be targeted in order to prevent mood disorders. So how does this fit into the big picture? Well, I wanted to make this video because I wanted to highlight and illustrate that what I tend to see when I'm making videos on mood disorders is that people jump to L-tryptophan, or they jump to 5-hydroxytryptophan, and really I think a good anti-depressive diet, or a good anti-anxiety diet, really needs to start with incorporating more of these types of plant foods into the diet. The power of these plant foods can't be underestimated. The amount of plants that have been investigated and shown to have anxiolytic or antidepressive effects is very large and growing all the time. Many of them are herbs, there are spices, many of them are just common foods. And really I think that should be the first line of defense against the development of mood disorders or the treatment of existing mood disorders. Having a very high quality diet that contains lots of plant foods, really, when you look at the mechanisms that these chemicals within the plants have in the brain, they're actually very, very effective, and often more effective than pharmaceutical drugs. And this is just one illustration. And green leafy vegetables are very easy to incorporate into your diet. You can incorporate easily 100 grams of spinach into your diet by simply having a smoothie. You don't even if you don't like the taste of spinach, the spinach disappears into the mayo of all the other fruits and whatever else you put in the smoothie. So there's no excuse not to put these in your diet. They're very easy to get in your diet. And the other thing about green leafy vegetables is they're so cheap. Supermarkets virtually give them away. Many vegetables are very cheap anyway, but green leafy vegetables, because they're not widely consumed but they're very easy to grow, they tend to be, because of supply and demand, they tend to be very cheap. So spinach is relatively cheap, kale is very cheap, you can eat cabbage. I mean, anything that is a leaf from a plant will have rubisco in it, and therefore it will supply rubiscolin 6, and it will supply rubimetide. So, and these are only two of the breakdown products that we know of. There may be more. So try and think of the whole picture. Try and think of nutrition as something that is required all the time, and really the basics, the foundation of a good diet needs to come from more vegetables, some fruit, but don't overdo the fruit because of the high fructose content. But generally, vegetables should be the mainstay of any healthy diet. Obviously, you need to have protein, you need to have essential fats, but it's those vegetables that have virtually no calories in them, but they're absolutely packed with these phytonutrients, and many of them we haven't identified, or those that we have identified, we're not exactly sure how they work. There is evidence to show they're effective, but this is something that's going to be, I think, a big area of research in the future. So have a look into those compounds. Have a look and see if you can incorporate more green leafy vegetables into your diet, because they're a great source of nutrients. You'll also get vitamin K. There's vitamin C in many of the green leafy vegetables. There are other antioxidants. There are carotenoids. There's chlorophyll. Many minerals, many vitamins. They're a very good source of dense nutrients with virtually no calories at all. So I hope you found that interesting. As always, eat well, stay healthy, and protect yourself. And I will see you soon for another video. Take care.